The Holy Gospel according to Mark. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He did not want anyone to know it, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, "The Son of Man is to be betrayed into human hands, and they will kill him. And 3 days after being killed, he will rise again." But they did not understand what he was saying and were afraid to ask him. Then they came to Capernaum, and when he was in the house, he asked them, "What were you arguing about along the way?" But they were silent. For on the way they had argued with one another who was the greatest. He sat down, called the 12, and said to them, "Whoever wants to be first must be last of all and servant of all." Then he took a little child and put it among them, and taking it in his arms, he said to them, "Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes not me, but the one who sent me." The gospel of the Lord. Isn't it typical of us? We want to know who's going to be the greatest, who is going to stand tall among all of our brothers and sisters, who's going to be first. They even argued with themselves. Now imagine if we were to be talking amongst ourselves and there's the Lord with us, and we argue about, well, who's going to be the greatest? Well, it must be me because I'm the pastor. Or Deb and Shonda say, well, it must be us because we're co-sams with you. Or Jeannie Cummings saying, must be me because I play the piano. And Nicole saying, well, I play the piano too. Or Bev Hakenen, well, I play the organ. And yet there's the Lord with us. Whoever is going to be great has to be a servant of all. Jesus is talking about us demeaning ourselves, not in a false sense, but in a sense of you got to serve. If you want to be great, you got to be the least. And then he takes that little child and puts it among them, holds it in his arms, he says, and says, whoever wants to be great must be like this little one. I wish I had prepared to show you a woodcut by Rembrandt. And in this one woodcut, this etching, there's Jesus standing actually on a rock, I think, or like a platform. And there's all the disciples and everybody listening around. Everyone has surrounded him and they're looking up with awe at him. But his eyes are fixed on this little child. This little child isn't even facing Jesus' direction. This little child is laying on the ground in the dirt. It looks like he's playing marbles, but he's probably just throwing stones about. But Jesus is looking affectionately at that little child. If we want to be great, we got to be like that little child. Sure, listening, because we all know that children are listening even when we think they're not. But this child was simply going about the activities of being a child. What does it mean to be like a child? To be innocent? Surely. To be without rancor? Yeah. Oh, we know children get angry, but we also know that they can be furious with each other and you have to separate them. And then an hour later, they're out in the yard playing again as if nothing had happened. Yeah, I think that's what Jesus is talking about. Well, now we look in the letter of James, and we've read it just a minute ago, but I'm going to read it again. James says, who is wise and knowledgeable among you? Show by your good life that your works are done with gentleness born of wisdom. But if you have bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not be arrogant about it and lie about the truth. This is not the wisdom that comes down from above, but is earthly, unspiritual, devilish. For where there is envy and selfish ambition, there will also be disorder and wickedness of every kind. But the wisdom from above is first pure, then peaceable, gentle, willing to yield, full of mercy and good fruits, without a trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And the fruit of righteousness is shown in peace, is sown in peace by those who make peace. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Do they come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something and do not have it, so you commit murder. And you covet something and cannot obtain it, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly, in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. Submit yourself, therefore, to God. Resist the devil, and he will flee from you. Draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. Cleanse your hands, you sinners, and purify your hearts, you double-minded. Well, here, James is telling us, what does childlike, not childish, childlike wisdom look like? What is childlike behavior? Well, in the time that James was writing, it was called, known as, in the times just before James, it was called the Jewish War. That lasted from somewhere around 66 to 73 of the Common Era, AD. But also, they had in mind the Maccabean revolt, when Judas Maccabeus and his sons led the revolt against the Macedonian rulers, the Seleucid Empire, it was called, the Seleucid dynasty. And they were teaching that, hey, to rebel against unjust authority, that's an act of devotion too. That's an act of zealousy, an act of zeal. But James is saying, maybe not. He says that the wisdom that is peaceable, the wisdom that leads with gentleness, that's wisdom that comes from above. And when they talk about it coming from above, they mean that it is wisdom that comes from God. Since the time of Plato and into the times of the Greek philosophers Plutarch and even Philo of Alexandria, they had taught and they believed that war is devilish, that it's not merciful, it's not good fruits. And yet James is saying here that this envy and this selfish ambition, this is what leads to disorder and wickedness of every kind. This is what leads to conflict and war. He's saying, be gentle, be forgiving. That wisdom that comes from God is peaceable. It doesn't lead to war. It doesn't lead to conflict. And he's not just talking about the conflict among brothers and sisters. He's not just talking about conflict in our neighborhood. He's talking about war as well. He really does have in mind this war that's going on against the Romans, this rebellion against the Romans. He's saying we must be pure, peaceable, gentle, willing to yield. Boy, that's something we hate, to yield. If I yield, then I'm admitting that I'm wrong. Or maybe even I'm admitting I'm weak. Okay. Because what follows next is full of mercy. I'm willing to say I'm wrong if it leads to mercy, if it leads to peace, without any trace of partiality or hypocrisy. And that fruit of righteousness that is sown in peace, it's by those who make peace. Doesn't Jesus tell us about blessed are the peacemakers? It's not always enough to be right. It's not always enough to have the truth on our side. But where do these conflicts come from? James asks. Those conflicts, those disputes, where do they come from? They come from what's inside of us, the cravings that are inside of us. Paul talks about the war in our members. You want something, you don't have it, so you commit murder, he says. Now, of course, he's not really saying it's called hyperbole. And this was a typical tactic of the rabbis and the teachers of his time that, yeah, hyperbole. You overstate something in order to make your point. You covet something and you don't have it, you can't get it. So you engage in conflicts and disputes. You don't have it because you don't ask for it. Just ask. You don't have to fight. You don't have to struggle. You ask. And if you still ask and you don't get it, well, then you're asking wrongly. But submit yourselves to God. And in that way, we resist the devil. And the devil will flee from that because the devil doesn't know anything about human diabolic interests and human selfishness. That's the devilish part. I'm not worried about some personification of evil that we call the devil. I'm more concerned with the devil inside of us, the selfishness inside of us, the evil part of us. Resist that, submit ourselves to God, and those interests, those compulsions will begin to flee from us because we draw near to God and God draws near to us. But what does the redeemed life look like? What does the life that is empowered by the wisdom from God, what does it look like? Again, James tells us very clearly, it has no selfish ambition. It has no envy, no disorder, no wickedness, but wisdom that is pure and makes peace and is gentle, is willing to yield. Or as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 13, it does not insist on its own way. James continues that it's full of mercy and good fruits, without hypocrisy. And those who make peace will see the fruit of righteousness sown in peace and growing to fruit in us. If we have conflicts, even amongst ourselves, we need to ask ourselves, have I been following the wisdom of God? Have I been following that wisdom that is pure? Am I following the way of peace? When God has spoken to us, it's the way of peace. When God has changed our lives, hypocrisy disappears. And we only want what's good for each other. That's the way of peace. That's the way of the Lord. That's what James is talking about. Follow that way of peace. When there's struggling amongst us ourselves, we're not following the way of wisdom. And that's the way of righteousness. Thanks be to God.